Hey everyone, this is Erica Lucas, your host and founding member of VEST, an organization connecting women across industries, regions, and career levels so that together we can expedite the pipeline of more women in positions of power and influence. Welcome to another episode of the Vester podcast, where we explore the invisible barriers holding women back in the workplace and share stories of women building power collectively.
I don't think we talk enough about the idea that women can create legacies as well, right? All the buildings on our universities have names of men on them. And I think now it's like women's time to create our legacies. And when we look across the US in the next 50 years or 100 years, you're going to see our names on buildings and our names on endowments and our legacies left behind for the future young girls who come through this process and they're not having the same conversations that we're having today because their generations have created a world where they are truly in power and they can empower others.
Sevetri Wilson is the founder and CEO of Resiliency, a technology company enabling nonprofits to increase capacity. She's also the author of Resilient: How to Overcome Anything and Build $1 Million Business with or Without Capital. Prior to founding Resiliency at age 22, Sevetri bootstrapped her first company, Solid Ground Innovations, to 7 figures without raising any outside funding. Since launching Resiliency, Sevetri has raised more than $11 million, making her one of only 50 Black women in the United States to have raised more than $10 million in venture capital. Sevetri has been named a rising star on the Forbes Cloud 100 list, and her company Resiliency was named one of VentureBeat's top startups to watch out for in 2019. Sevetri is also the recipient of the Nobel Prize for Public Service and the Jefferson Award. Join us as we talk to Sevetri about building resiliency and overcoming bias in order to build meaningful and profitable companies. This recording was part of a more intimate coaching session with VEST members and has been repurposed to accommodate this episode.
So I grew up in a pretty small town in Louisiana, about 30 minutes outside of New Orleans, where my mother's from. My father's from Hammond, Louisiana. And for me, there was so much about just the world that I wasn't exposed to until I went on to college, LSU. I was a first generation college student. When I was going through college, I was definitely on a mission. I was on a mission to build this life and career so that I could actually support my mother, who was a single mother, had raised a family of 4 by working really long hours. And then probably about 3 months into my graduate program at LSU, my mother was diagnosed with cancer, pretty aggressive form of cancer, and would go on to pass away just 2 months later in December of that year. And so I started thinking about, okay, now what am I doing all of this for? What is the legacy that I'm trying to leave behind or even create in general where I can still help people? From there, I started thinking about what I was doing in my current employment, which was CASA. So those who aren't familiar, CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates for children who are essentially in and out of foster care. And I was working on that program and project inside of CASA to get more CASA volunteers, particularly volunteers of color and volunteers who were Black men, because a lot of the foster children were actually Black boys. But that was not the case when we looked across the volunteer threshold. And so I began to reach out to individuals who I went to LSU with. At this time, LSU was like dominating all sports. So we were NBA from Final Four collegiate basketball to national championships, football. And so I reached out to my friends who had now just went on to play professional sports. And I say, hey, I need for you guys to be the face of this campaign. And we're going to get more volunteers that look representative of those foster children to play a role. And so I did that. And then individuals began to reach out to me whether that was from like boosters, family foundations, those who I met with along the way. And they said, we would love for you to come in and actually help us advance the work that we're doing inside of our foundations and with our philanthropic efforts. And so that was actually the foundation that led me to create Solid Ground Innovations, my first company. And we were a nonprofit management consultancy agency. We were working with large funders like your Kellogg Foundations, your Ford Foundations, providing technical assistance to their grantees. And I started thinking about there has to be a better way to do this. The work that we were doing and the silos that we were seeing between grantees and grant makers. And tech in our space is very antiquated, dated. And so I started thinking about ways that we could essentially productize our services and deliver it through a software solution. And that's what gave rise to Resilia. And so I would say that, where I'm at today is like a full combination of my life, right? Playing out itself into building out my career.
What has been the most challenging aspect of building and scaling your company?
Yeah, I think that in tech, and even similarly, interesting enough, one of my customer success team members shared an article yesterday on our All Hands talking about how the funding disparity between nonprofits led by women and nonprofits led by men, right? And so even on that side, you see a disparity in how much money women-led organizations receive versus men-led organizations. In tech, a lot of the hurdles that I face, being a woman founder, being a Black woman founder, being a founder from the South, right? All of these things like combined and compounded were probably some of my largest hurdles that I faced and continue to face, right? So I think that although I have made great strides and some of my accomplishments, there's probably not a day that goes by where it's like, okay, how can I better position myself? And I would tell people all the time that I would go into investor rooms and I would come in with the mentality that I was already down, right? I was already down by 10 points. And so my first objective was to earn and gain 10 points to try to level the foundation as much as possible. And then from there to present at such a pace that I could not be denied, right? And so I think these are some of the challenges that generally minority founders face. And we kind of think about consistently how our identity impacts our success.
One of the things that we're trying to do at Vest is, okay, so let's talk about the challenges. Let's talk about the systemic barriers. But then what do we do about it, right? And how do we overcome it? Not that we like the rules, not that we created the rules, and not that we shouldn't change the rules, but right now, here are the rules. Here's how the game is played. How do you overcome? So that's my question to you. What did you do despite, showing up 10% more prepared or 10%, knowing that you have to gain that advantage? What other things did you have to do to have like a winner mentality as opposed to a victim mentality? People are victims of a system that treats us unequally, but how do we build that mindset of we can still win despite of?
Yeah, I think that it kind of goes back to what you said. And I always tell women founders and founders of color that you can't let the process jade you, because it can jade you, and that can come off in how you react and even how you speak to investors and others who are trying to learn about your company and maybe potentially support you. And because we face so many barriers and receive so many no's, the volume of that, and just generally aren't treated right, right? And so some of that can come off into our energy and how we present. So I'm always saying, don't let the process jade you. And you have to really focus in on how do you put the right people around you that can help you navigate places, spaces, and like systems in a way that really does put your ultimate objective where, for me, maybe it was like raising capital, or maybe it's like closing a contract deal where you're best positioned to actually win. And so when I think about what we can do in order to do that, that's one combination of it. The other side of it is ensuring that individuals like us actually are the ones having the ability to write checks, right? And so changing the playing field from who actually is in power and who sits in those positions of power. And so like Maria and others who see founders who have great companies and ideas who may not get funded by, you know, a white guy in Silicon Valley, but she sees their opportunity and their potential and sees their concept or MVP or company so that it can continue to grow and scale. We need to create and expand that landscape of individuals. And so definitely changing the power dynamic is important.
And the nonprofit sector as well, right? Like private sector fundraising, whether it's venture capital, but also you just mentioned on the nonprofit and the funders look very different than the people actually doing the work on a day-to-day basis.
Exactly.
You know, one of the reasons, again, why we launched VEST, as you heard at the beginning, is because we believe that oftentimes social capital, it's more important than actual capital and leveraging the networks. And I think that our male peers have done that very well for years, where they leverage their networks to get hired, appointed, promoted, invested in, reinvested in, et cetera. And for one reason or another, women have, well, I do know the reasons. Actually, a lot of times we just don't have time to play golf and or the resources and the stamina. But one of the reasons why we launched VEST is, okay, so we know that whether we like it or not, we still hire, promote, appoint, and all of that through networks. So let's build that power collectively. How did social networks play a part in where Resilia is today, and even just your accomplishments in general?
Definitely. So I mentioned that I started my first company. I was fairly young and very just naive to the world of business to begin with at 22. But one thing that I kind of always understood, even at a very young age, was the power of network. I didn't come from a family, with names where everybody knew. They didn't pass on social capital to me. And so when I first started my business, I began to reach out to people in the community, starting with my local politicians. So whether it was my city council member or my state rep, and believe it or not, these people are actually supposed to meet with their constituents, right? And so I would reach out to their aides and ask for meetings, and they actually took the meetings with me, and I used to go and meet with them. And the thing about meeting with politicians is they know everyone, right? They know everyone in the community. They know who has the money because they're always raising capital. They're always raising money, for their next race or the things that they need, the projects that they need to fund. And I would go and meet with them, and then they would give me all the information, right, on all these different people and who I should know and who has a big project coming up. And I would make a list and I would begin to reach out to those individuals. And that's really how I began to build my first business. Now, fast forward, by building those relationships, being a part of my Chamber of Commerce, and then being appointed to the Downtown Development District Board, still at a very young age, I began to network and meet people. And so when I went to raise my first angel round, and I would consider this my pre-seed round, or people consider friends and family. It was not friends and family for me, but it was generally individuals who I had met along the way in business. And I reached out to them, and they helped me raise $400,000, right? And so we think about the power of social capital. You may not need people today or tomorrow, but you may need them eventually. And if you create that rapport with them, people will show up for you. So I do believe in the power of social capital. And I think it definitely has helped me along the way.
Just a side note from that, because we have founders in here. By the way, if you are a founder or an entrepreneur, that's whether you're raising capital or not, do you mind just kind of waving so that we can see you? And so I know that this resonates a lot, not having friends and family with the generational wealth to be able to tap into. I talk about that a lot on my other job. But I think another thing that we need to talk about when it comes to fundraising is that this expectations or this notion that we often have that the checks have to be large enough to make up your deal. So can you talk about how small of a check did you accept in your very first round, if you remember?
So I would probably say my smallest check was $5,000, but it's interesting that you asked that, because there's this thing going around Twitter right now about how small can an investor check be. And so people are talking about like these $1,000 to $10,000 checks. And I think that that's like powerful. People like, some of the companies in Silicon Valley that we know today started because someone invested $1,000 or $2,000 into that company. And so there's so many vehicles now that make it easier to accept smaller checks. But for me, the smallest check that we received in our earliest round was $5,000.
Yeah, I just think that often we see entrepreneurs thinking that they're going, they're raising a 400,000 round and they think the one investor is going to lead all of that, and or they need to have investors that come in with 100,000 or 25,000. It's like, hey, there's no shame in accepting the smaller checks, especially if they're additive investors, right? Especially if they're going to open their networks. Gabby just asked everyone, we don't have to wait until the end to incorporate member questions. And there is one question in the chat from Noor, and she says, how to approach your connections or maintain a relationship that would allow you to ask for help when establishing a new company. Can you give us an example of how you did it?
Yeah, so for me, depending on the contact or relationship, sometimes I would just build relationships because I am a part of membership organizations with other women or people. And so we're connected through the membership, right? And so maybe we have events and we see each other at those events. And so that's enough connectivity to ensure when you're in those rooms that you're speaking with people, that you're asking them, getting updates on lives and those things, and so on and so forth. But then when it came to individuals who became, that were more like, I would say, prominent, as people would say, in the community. For example, like Rod West, who's like an advisor of mine. I found him because a friend of mine, we were having coffee, and he was like, man, you should really know Rod West. He's like the president or then vice president of Industry Corporation, which is a Fortune 500 company. But he didn't have the ability to intro me to him. He was like, oh, he's this prominent figure. So I get online and I start like Googling his name, and I try to reverse engineer the search so I could find his email address. So I found his email address, sent him an email, and I was like, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I looked at his background and made a connection. And so I'd love to have, 30 minutes of your time. And he responded saying, I don't know how you got past my gatekeepers, but since you're here, here's my assistant's email, let's schedule some time. And so I went and met with him. And then ongoing, like every quarter, I would just schedule an hour of his time to like update him, go in. I would always leave with an ask, even if it was like information or introduction. And so we built a relationship that way. And he ultimately became one of my larger angel investors, as well as, we now have a contract with Energy Corporation because of our relationship as well. So I think that when you think about how do you build relationships and how do you maintain them, just go about it in a very like genuine and like mutually giving way. And mutually giving may not be that you have something to give to them, but it's something that my one of my mentors, Alfred Edmond, who is over at Black Enterprise, always says, people will invest in you, but eventually they're going to want a return on their investment. And their return is you actually doing the things that you said you're going to do.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm really going to encourage the members to, this is your time to get to know Sevetri. So please leverage it to your advantage. But my question is, being a women's only club, which I'm very proud of, but I also don't want to turn a blind eye to the fact that sometimes the patriarchy is not just men, right? Sometimes we women feel like we need to compete with each other or not be as supportive. And sometimes it's because, there's been so few of us at the top that we've kind of been trained to compete, right? Because that is who is most accepted in the workplaces, is that persona. We talked to Michelle King about that earlier in the year, about how workplaces weren't designed for women, and they're really designed, and even if we remove gender, they're designed for this persona that tends to be very competitive, works nonstop, has probably very unhealthy work habits. But that's that's what we see when we think of successful leaders. And as such, I think that sometimes it has led women to maybe feel like we need to compete with each other. But anyway, my question to you is, have you ever experienced that in your career, and how did you go about handling that? And what advice do you have for us to overcome that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely, when I first started my collegiate career, I actually wanted to be a journalist, so completely nowhere doing what I'm doing now. And in media, like the competition with women was definitely something that was almost like poisonous, right? And so have felt this kind of sentiment throughout my career, not as much, I would say, like over time. As I've moved forward, but I do feel like it is something that is real, and we are put in a situation where people expect us to compete, or oh, there's only going to be one woman at the top that has this C-level suite. So who of the women here will get that job or that role? And again, it's the power dynamics that have kind of put those structures in place to make it feel like this crabs in a bucket type mentality where people are like pulling each other down, trying to get to the top. And so I think that we definitely have to like resist that that type of competitive nature where it's like, I don't want to see you do well, right? At the sake of me, at the sake of me achieving something, but versus collectively, if we all work together, then we can all move ahead together. And so I hope that that's a sentiment in which I feel things are moving towards, but there's always, those exceptions where individuals kind of face that one-on-one. For me being a Black woman, it's interesting because I would talk to other Black female founders, and we would say that sometimes our strongest allies were actually white men because they didn't see us as competition. And so when we think about like our cap table and who invested in our companies, it's interesting because if you look across Black female founded companies, in my era, my generation, I would say, it's different now because now we have so many more funds that are run by minorities. But when I started raising capital and, white men had to pocket, the checks, we found that it was less competitive of a nature spirit by having white men as allies because they just generally didn't see Black women's competition. Now, whether that's a good thing, right, or a bad thing, when you think about it, it was the reality of the situation. And women are harder on women as well.
We are. Yeah. I mean, we can, again, have a whole other session, and we will actually in August. We're bringing Farai, who's going to talk to us about this. But, well, no, great. Thank you for that, Sevetri. And we actually have questions, but I'm going to put our members on the spot and ask you to unmute yourself and turn on your camera and just go ahead and ask it. This is your space.
So, Sevetri, I have a company that serves nonprofits. So we're a fundraising company. And I feel like there's a little bit of a stigma around what we do. When I start to talk about my company, most people, I feel like I get the proverbial pat on the head, like, oh, that's nice. You help nonprofits. Like, it's deeply offensive, both to what like nonprofits do and to the work that we do. But it is like this persistent apathy until they realize that we're in 6 states and we have 25 employees, and they're like, oh, this isn't like a little homegrown sweet thing that you do out of your house out of the goodness of your heart. When you were first talking to donors and investors, is that kind of sense of apathy around nonprofit work or supporting nonprofits? Did you experience that, and how did you overcome it?
For sure. I always say that our platform couldn't exist 10 years ago because investors just didn't feel like it was a true market. You had like Blackbot that was kind of like dominating everything, and they were just creating verticals all over the place because they didn't have any competition. But now it's different. Like I receive so much inbound from investors saying, we've been following the nonprofit space, and we really like what's happening there. Because you have to make people aware of not only is there a market, as well as the nonprofit space being one of the largest employers, right? When we think about workforce development in the US, when we look at the GDP across the board, you have to bring the facts to the table to make people really see what we have here. But I would say 10 years ago, it wouldn't have worked. But now people actually see that there is a culture shift where people are no longer saying, are no longer not holding people accountable. And the accountability has been through standing up funds. And so we think about 2020 and the large number of dollars that were put in place, whether that's setting up funds or dispersing out new grants. You see the activity. You see billionaire pledges, right? Mackenzie Scott just gave another $2 billion to nonprofits yesterday. And so now funders or investors are saying, oh, wait, this actually is a sector that we should be paying attention to that has generally been overlooked. And so my inbound is very reflective of that. You also see others who are starting and gaining ground in the space, like Salesforce. And I'm tech for good. And so Salesforce over the past 3 years have acquired almost $1 billion worth of companies in our space, right? And so they also acquired Salesforce.org, which used to be a nonprofit. A little background on how they did that, but I'll say the background on how they were able to do that. But they did it because it was making $400 million a year and they could no longer ignore it. And they wanted it to be something that they can take the profit from. So they moved it underneath Salesforce and began to acquire other companies around it, right? Around that space. So I do feel that that was the case. And for people who may not be aware of the market size and the growth of the market over the past few years, that they may still say that. But once you reveal the numbers, as well as the numbers that your company, right, is doing, people have like an aha moment.
100%. And, you know, I would say, Sevetri, as well, even if you're not in the nonprofit space, heck, I'm even experienced it with Vest. But it's, if you're a woman-led company, immediately when you talk to investors, they put you in the category of impact investing as opposed to, for-profit investing. Has anybody ever said you should just go to impact investors?
Yes, we have no impact investors. I would take some impact money if they in the future if we wanted to, if it's non-dilutive. But we never went towards impact investors. People have mentioned it before, but for the most part, we are growing at the same rate as higher than the average SaaS tech company, irregardless of sector. And so people just look at it as a business, enterprise business model that works and that has a large enough market to scale to 100, million ARR company, right? So sometimes the numbers are just what they are, and you can't deny the growth and scale that's there, nor like the network effect that you can create with nonprofits and like funders and how that looks overall. But when I think about like impact investors, there are opportunities for that. But again, going back to like men doing things, you'll have investors tell like femtech companies that they should look at impact investors. And we just read an article about like 3 white guys who started a company to address women's menstrual cycles. It was like, what? And they raised like millions of dollars to do it, whereas women companies can't even raise the same type of money regarding their own health, right? And so when men do it, it's like this grand idea that has nothing to do with social impact and just a good business idea. But when women do it, for some reason, there's this, oh, what world? You're trying to save the world. Well, most women, yeah, we're getting a business where we are trying to save you guys from yourselves in many ways.
100%. And, I think we should change the narrative. And I think that younger generation is doing a much better job than previous generation at saying and kind of preaching that, hey, we can build profitable companies that are still good for our communities. Like it shouldn't be an either or. Anyway, but that's again another conversation. We have a question from Courtney, who I think can join us live because she's driving, so be safe, Courtney. But she says, I feel like fundraising can be such a personal and vulnerable process. How did you build resilience, tied to your book, to digest the no's on your way to the perfect yes when fundraising?
Yes, it's definitely a very personal, vulnerable, and like humbling process. Probably the most humbling process that I've ever been through, for sure. And I remember like raising my seed round and thinking like, oh man, I don't know if we're going to be able to get this done. Like, I don't know, I'm running out of steam, I'm running out of gas. And then an investor, Tim Milliken, came in and invested in the company, and it like literally turned our entire round around. And so I always say that you really do have to have like that resiliency to keep going, but also to understand what is it that you need to do to make it work for you, right? So that you're not just spinning your wheels unsuccessfully. And you do kind of have to like embrace the fact that it does put you in a vulnerable spot to kind of open up your entire, like your baby, your company to someone and then them telling you no, right? And so I definitely think that you have to be able to departmentalize, these no's that are coming at you. At the same time as understanding, objectively, there is still the opportunity that next door is going to open, and it's going to be like the yes I need to continue to grow my business and take in capital. So it's definitely a balance, and you have to put the right people around you. I always tell founders, like, don't go into like a dark hole. Like, talk to other founders, like, get that motivation around you, because you can be in the slump if you don't do that, for sure. And it's definitely, I've had founders like, yeah, I got this no, I thought it was going to be a yes. They took me through like 3 months of diligence, and then they told me no, right? Those are the ones that could crush you. So you definitely have to stay vigilant.
And some no's turn into yes laters, right? Like, it could be, to me, for my experience raising capital, is like I got a lot of no's at first. And then for whatever reason, even if it was because another investor, maybe like Sevetri, you did, invested, now there's FOMO, and now it's like, oh, here's a rest. And whether that's right or wrong, that does happen. But I felt like for me, just taking no's as it's a no right now, but it might turn into a yes later in the future. That way, to your point earlier, that we shouldn't take things personally and don't become jaded with the process. All right, take the no's, put it in the file, pitch them again later, or whatever, or not, right? But
Yeah.
I love how you tie those two.
Yeah, it's okay to feel all the feelings, right? You just gotta
100%.
put together.
100%. I also thought myself that, I actually love no's almost as much as I love yes. What I don't like is the maybes, because they drag you on for so long. So like, actually, if somebody says no, okay, great. You know what you want, you know what you don't want. So do I. Move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Sevetri, your book talks about a lot more than just fundraising. And I encourage everyone to get your books. I want you to tell us where to get it, but I also want you to tell us what to look for. What are, like, if you had to pick 3 takeaways from your latest book or your first one, what would they be?
So one kind of exists in my title, and when I kind of titled the book, how to overcome anything, people were like, overcome anything? Like, really, can you really overcome anything? And kind of what I mean by that is, even in failure, you can overcome it, right? And so I think that nothing is permanent in itself. Even if you're not successful at something, you can get back up and do something else, right? That you will be that much more successful in. And so I think that is definitely like one. Secondly, is going back to your question earlier about like social capital, like who you put around you, and who you're connected to, just like amplifies everything around you, and how successful you ultimately are. And so like your networks, and creating strong networks and being a part of them and also contributing to them in meaningful ways is very important also. And then the third thing I kind of talk about, like the ability to create wealth, right? And so for like women to create wealth, and then women can fund the LPs and all these other things and funds. I don't think we talk enough about the idea that women can create legacies as well, right? All the buildings on our universities have names of men on them. And I think now it's like women's time to create our legacies. And when we look across the US in the next 50 years, 100 years, you're going to see our names on buildings and our names on endowments, and our legacies left behind for the future young girls who come through this process, and they're not having the same conversations that we're having today, because their generations have created a world where they are truly in power and they can empower others.
I love that. And again, preach. We just had a session on building wealth and invest and becoming investors ourselves. Sevetri, something that you mentioned that I want to touch on, because I think it's right. It's one thing to join networks, whether it's Vest or Founders Network, whatever you join. And it's another one to feel like you actually are getting something. And we always say, both at Stitch Crew and at Vest, we always say you're going to get out of the program what you put in. And you mentioned contribution, because I think that for us women, sometimes it's harder to, I don't even call it networking. I think for us it's more building community. I also think that for us is like, how do we feel comfortable asking for help, and how do we feel comfortable contributing and feeling like we can contribute to something? So what would you say around that?
Really, you kind of have to just, going back to vulnerability, right? You kind of have to put yourself out there to like ask the question. Because I always find that when someone asks a question, someone probably likely has like an answer to it, or they have like resources to support that answer. But if no one ever asks the question, you never create the environment where it feels okay to ask. But if one person does it, like, oh, well, actually, I had a question on this. Maybe I should ask this question. And you start creating that environment where people feel comfortable to make different asks. I'm a part of this group, and someone was saying that they just shut down their startup a couple months ago. And ironically, impact investor reached out to them. They were in climate change, and they were like, oh, we're interested in maybe funding your business to get this back off the ground and like going. They read about them like in an article, didn't realize they had closed. And so she reached out to the group and said, I've never pitched to impact investors. Is there anyone that can help me think through this, or like nonprofits? And people responded, I responded, and then someone else on the group like responded saying, yes, we can set up a time to talk, right? And so I think you just have to put yourself out there to make that ask and be like vulnerable in that, right? She had never said before that her business had closed down. She wasn't, she had to be kind of vulnerable in order to like disclose that as well. But two members responded. And so I definitely think it's about like positioning yourself to just get a little uncomfortable if you're uncomfortable, and doing it and creating that consistent like dialogue.
Building personal brand and putting ourselves out there. I feel like just even with me, is sometimes it's uncomfortable, or sometimes we feel like, again, we shouldn't, let me not put my thoughts out there because we're afraid of the retribution or what people might say, or maybe I'm not a thought leader in that area yet, so I'm just going to hold back. And we create all of these scenarios in our head that may or may not be true. So from the beginning, when you started building your companies, did you just put yourself out there, or did that take you some time? And how did you walk us through how you got comfortable putting yourself out there and talking about it and building that resilience, maybe in just like getting out of your own head and taking the risk?
Yeah, I think that maybe it doesn't necessarily start with you reaching out to the whole group. Maybe it's like, oh, I might feel comfortable with one person that I resonate with, and maybe I'll have like a one-on-one, right? And kind of build up that muscle where it's like, oh, my questioning wasn't crazy. Like this person received it really well, so maybe others will receive my questions well also. And so I definitely think that like one-on-ones are and can be like really powerful and to build and deepen relationships. And then from there, kind of stepping out to like larger groups, because the idea of we consider like peer mentorship and mentors who are essentially closely connected to you in many ways where they can help you. And then where else also where you may be able to provide support or advice, or even like just be a sounding board for. And so maybe that's one way to like ease into it, is kind of take this like one-on-one approach versus like group approach. But then from there is power in groups as well. So don't stay in the one-on-ones forever, although you can also continue to have them.
We've been living under a system that still treat women unequally, but the pandemic only just made it worse. And now we're seeing that women may lose an average of $600,000 in lifetime value or generational wealth. What do we do besides talking about it and sharing those headlines? Like, how do we change it?
Well, I think one immediate opportunity, I think I thought about that question, and I'm thinking like, okay, people have said, oh, we need to have to push policies, right, for even like income gap and income disparities. Even in the South, we think about like women not supporting. In the South, in Louisiana, women legislators have voted down equal pay every single year. It's a fight every single year. And so you think like, man, how can women vote against equal pay, right? And it's just like mind blowing to me, but every year it's a fight. And now that we think about like what's happening post pandemic, one immediate thing that I think that we could do is locally is that, you know, there's a $1.2 trillion American Rescue Plan that was recently passed. Cities are about to receive so much money that they haven't seen in years, like billions, millions of dollars through that rescue plan. I think that is really important that we begin, as cities, they don't know what they're going to do with it yet. It's supposed to be for infrastructure and revitalization of cities post-pandemic. And I think that we need to have conversations with our elected officials and mayors to say that some of this money actually needs to be set aside for women and to address the problems that have had economically with women and workforce development specifically through cities. And so I think that's one thing that we could do like immediately where there's actual dollars and money tied to it, whether that is daycare assistance, right? Whether those key things that have been proven to have been the reason why there's such a huge disparity with women as a result of COVID-19 and the pandemic. So I think that that's like one immediate takeaway. And it's interesting because we're currently working with the White House on something. And from that question, I'm actually going to bring that back to them. So I'm going to bring that back.
Please bring it to them and tell them that if they want a group full of women that can give them ideas, we're game on.
Yes.
I love it. And by the way, we're based in Oklahoma, a lot of us. So when you talked about women voting against their own interests and or supporting candidates that further oppress us as opposed to lift us, it just like literally hit me on a totally different level. All right, so we have another question from Constance. Constance, why don't you just introduce yourself and unmute?
Hi, I'm Constance Fraley.
Hi.
I am with TDS Capital Funding. We are for profit. I haven't done a lot of work in the nonprofit realm. But Erica, you had mentioned we don't have a ton of time to go play golf. We don't have a ton of time to build that rapport. We don't feel like we do, or we don't choose to make that time. So in building and maintaining relationships, do you mostly focus on membership meetings, going to lunches, maybe doing an office visit? And are there any out of the box techniques that you use to build and maintain those relationships?
Mm-hmm. So if I like take the time, you have to think about like the time that you have in a day, right? You're like, okay, what do I have time to do? Yeah. And so when it comes to like building relationships with like your other members of organizations that you're a part of, I would kind of reserve those for membership meetings and, you know, like lunches and events that are kind of curated around that. And then you'll always have like one-off relationships that you may take beyond those things, right? Outside of those type of settings. When it comes to like one-on-ones, you have to think about what's the impact that this individual can have on my business or my organization or what I'm ultimately seeking to do, right? And that is where you may want to invest additional time, just like nurturing those type of relationships. I mentioned like one with Ride West and I have several others as well, where we've just kind of built this relationship where it's always going to be like one-on-ones and me taking out time to go meet them in their office or having one-on-one lunch. And from a personal perspective, as them like helping me become a better leader because they are just like amazing people, have also benefited me from a business perspective as well, because they have then opened up their box of social capital to allow me to access it. And so when we think about social capital, it's also the ability to access someone else's social capital too.
Hi, I'm Ashley Fazio. I'm here local actually in Oklahoma, and I founded PayPro. We're focused more on being a career growth platform, starting with salary all the way up to finance. And so my question is really more around the development side, being a software company, and how you really decided what were those features that you really needed for launch. I took a look at your website and there's so much functionality that you had. So how were you able to narrow that down in a succinct way that you could also pitch that to investors as well?
Yeah, when we first started off, we only had one product, and that was our formation product. So we were doing something simple for nonprofits, and that was actually just expediting the process of incorporation exemption through our formation product. And so that's what we did. And so we sought to develop just that one key thing where we could begin to actually sell it and generate revenue to show like, oh, like this product works, but here's the future and the vision of where we want to go and where we want to take it. And so I definitely think that what is the path of least resistance. I know people tell you that may be like, oh, you don't take the path of least resistance. But when you're talking about a product and trying to get something MVP to market, you definitely have to take the path of least resistance, because it's also going to be the least expensive path that you have to take. And you want to stay as lean as possible when you're trying to get that MVP out. And so, yeah, I think you're just trying to show proof of concept, and that there is an opportunity in market for what you're trying to build.
Sevetri, how do we find you? How do we contact you? And how do we buy your book?
Yeah, so my book can be purchased anywhere that books are sold, from Barnes & Noble to Books A Million, even Amazon, although I know people are, can be anti-Amazon, but you can also go to bookshop.org.
If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a review and subscribe to our podcast for future episodes. You can also join the conversation by becoming a Best member. Go to www.vester.co and apply today.